Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Ampere Developer Impact. A few months ago, I had a conversation with Bruno Verachten of the Jenkins project, and we talked about the history of Jenkins and Arm64 support and how to use Jenkins to build projects for Arm64. I think it was a great conversation. I hope you get a lot out of it. For those who are not familiar with it, can you describe what Jenkins is, what it does, and why somebody would want to use it?
Oh, yeah. So Jenkins is open source. You got it. It's an automation server, which is widely used for continuous integration called CI and continuous delivery or deployment called CD in software development mostly. Of course, you can configure it to do lots of other things, but most of its job is that just CI and CD. So it helps with the building, testing, and deploying of software applications. So for continuous integrations, Jenkins, for example, can monitor repositories where developers store their code, such as Git repository. It may be GitHub, GitLab, GitHub, whatever. And whenever there are changes made to the code base, then Jenkins automatically triggers some new build process. And during the build process, Jenkins will compile the code, run automated tests, and generate reports on the build status, for example. And the second part is CD, continuous deployment or delivery. So Jenkins can also be used for CD, which implied automating the process of deploying software to various environments, such as staging or production, or even for mobile app, the Google Play Store or the App Store. So Jenkins can orchestrate, and that's, I think, the most important word, orchestrate, the deployment process, including tasks such as packaging the application, deploying it to servers, and running tests, for example, in the deployment environment. And to do so, it's not magic. There is a language, a file, some code. It's pipeline as code. So Jenkins allows users to define build and deployment processes as code thanks to what we call a Jenkins file. And so people from the team can version control their build and deployment pipelines along with their application code or even in another repo if needed. So that makes the entire process more reproducible and manageable. Versioning the pipeline is something I really like.
Bruno, Jenkins has worked on ARM64 for quite some time, isn't that right?
Yeah, you're right. But some people would say we are cheating. We're cheating because Jenkins is mostly written in Java, and Java is write once and debug everywhere or something like that. If you have, yeah, if you have a Java virtual machine somewhere, Jenkins may be able to run on top of it. So, yes, that's why I say we are cheating. But most of the code is just Java code for Jenkins. But we have, of course, a few libraries which depend on native code, on x86 code. So these parts are not yet migrated to ARM64, but the Jenkins core is working perfectly on ARM64. Yes, you talked about the version 303, 2.303 from 2021. Yes, I was not there yet in the Jenkins project at that time, so I don't know. Yeah, but I know the discussion started in 2020 with Olivier Vernin, who is now part of OpenSUSE. Um, he thought that the ARM64 architectures were important for the Jenkins project. And then Jenkins only lived thanks to support. We are an open source project. We only get support via cloud providers, for example, or other supporting companies like JFrog for our Artifact, so we had some credits from cloud providers in 2021. I think it was Oracle that gave us access to various machines, and some of them were ARM64. And they were cheaper, if I'm not mistaken, than x86. So we migrated one service to ARM64, which is archives, jenkins.io, to the Oracle Cloud, and it worked. So nothing to do, especially for ARM64.
Do you have a lot of end users using Jenkins on ARM64?
Using ARM64 for the Jenkins infrastructure is fine, and we'll talk about that maybe later on. But having somebody, an end user, with an ARM64 machine and able to use Jenkins because his architecture is not supported. That's a pain in the neck. So we had to do something about that. Earlier, a few years ago, who were the people using Arm64? Some of them were Raspberry Pi users, people using SBCs, small machines. There weren't that many people using ARM64 in the server room. So there weren't that many requests. Hey, could you please do something for Jenkins and ARM64? I'm in dire strait. I need to do that. No, that was not the case. So we were ahead of time by providing ARM64 build for Jenkins. But then Apple changed the game when they started to supply ARM64 machines, their laptops. And so we had to do something, and people were more pressing. Say, I need something for ARM64 because it's a pity to have something to translate from x86 to ARM64. I would like to have ARM64 binaries. And that changed, I think, the whole game, not only for Jenkins, but for a lot of other projects. And then we have, Jenkins built itself with Jenkins. It's some kind of inception. Jenkins run Jenkins to build Jenkins. And the infrastructure, I don't know if we'll see the figure later on, but it cost us quite a lot of money. I think it was something about 300,000 K in 2022. All of that is money given by the cloud providers, so we're always trying to get the best bang for the buck because it's even not our money, it's just donations. We were at the time with Amazon as a cloud provider, and we did not configure well enough our labels. So we had something called Docker Linux, and somehow we had a node pool of ARM64 node that were also tagged Docker Linux. So without us knowing, because we failed at giving a very precise label, some of our builds started to build on ARM64 without us knowing it. It was just faster, for whatever reason, cheaper, and there was a 2% raise in errors because, of course, some of the native libraries weren't available on ARM64. But then we changed the label so that we only targeted x86. The experimentation was fine. Even if we didn't do it on purpose, we knew there was something to do regarding to ARM64 because, we don't have that much money, so we have to be very careful how we spend it. And then we had some other cloud providers credits, for example, at Oracle. So we tried to experiment with ARM64 on Oracle later on. And then Oracle stopped sponsoring Jenkins, and Azure, Microsoft, started to sponsor Jenkins. So we migrated what we could to the Azure cloud provider, but not for ARM64. We were extra cautious because even if we know that it's working, we have to start ARM machines, ARM VMs, and see what's going on. Is it really working? Yes, and when we know it's working, all the tests are green, then we can switch off some x86 machines and then keep the ARM64 machines. So there is a time where we have x86 and ARM64 at the same time, so the budget is increasing, but then we switch off the Intel and then we save some money. And there are also Ampere machines, if I'm not mistaken.
On Azure, they are indeed, yes. May I ask, so you've talked about the Jenkins core working on ARM64, but for how long has Jenkins supported ARM build nodes?
Since 2021 or so. In fact, most of the nodes that we deal with are using Docker or Kubernetes, so containers. And the proof I have is that the earliest image we have with ARM64 dates from July, I think, 2021. So we've been supporting that for quite a while now.
So can we have a look? Can you show us what Jenkins looks like and show us what Jenkins running on ARM64 looks like?
Yeah, I can show you how it looks like, but it would be maybe funnier if I could start it on the ARM64 machine. Okay, so you can see my screen. That's cool. So this machine is... Oh, an Ampere machine. It's not written on it, but it's an Arch64 machine from the Oracle Cloud free tier program. So anyone with a credit card can have for free one Arch64 machine, which is pretty powerful.
Yes, I think it's up to 4 cores and up to 24 gigs of RAM.
Yeah, 4 cores. You're right. Okay, because when you start, you have something like $300 of credits, and then you can buy for a few weeks a pretty nifty machine with lots of cores and memory. I think I went with 196 gig of memory, because why not? Anyway, yeah, I love it. When you launch HTOP and you see a whole screen taken with everything going red, that's pretty funny. Um, so last year in Google Summer of Code, we had a project called Quick Start Tutorials, because the tutorials we used to have were difficult to start with. It was with Docker, but you had to know Docker very deeply before even starting the tutorial, and that's not what we want. So we rewrote everything from scratch, and now we have something pretty easy. You just have to take a git clone of a repo, and then type docker compose up -d and the target. For example, we have a tutorial for Maven. So it will start up a Jenkins instance with one agent, node, you name it, that will be able to build Maven. Oh, it's already done. Woo. And the compose logs. Oh, come on. So Jenkins is starting. This is no, it's not a weekly. As you can see, maybe at the bottom of the screen, it's a 2.46.3, so it's the latest long-term support version. And I will log in. I think, yep. Yeah. So we have Jenkins running with a simple demo job for the time being, something that runs every 5 minutes or so. And it's working on Arch64, and it took, 2 seconds to launch. It's pretty straightforward, frankly. There is nothing to do, nothing to know, and it's running on Arch64.
And so that's running with a cron job. But how do you monitor a Git repository? Do you need to configure the Git hook or a Git hook for Jenkins, or is it Jenkins that polls?
It depends. It's whatever you want to. It can check on the Git repo periodically and see if something has changed, or if you're using something like GitHub, for example, there are what we call webhooks. When GitHub just launches, it makes a post request on your Jenkins instance so that it knows that there is a new process, a new build process to launch.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all. So I had a few plugins to update. Unfortunately, that kind of things happens quite frequently. That's not mandatory, but I prefer to have everything up to date. And if we were to look at...
That's interesting. So it restarts the core, but any builds that are ongoing continue to work? Is that...
Yeah, the agents are independent from the core, so they won't be restarted. There I have 3 Docker containers, one of them being the agent, the Arch64 agent, this one, and it's independent from the core. So if the build is happening while we are restarting, that's not a problem. It will catch up later on.
So how complicated is it to provision a new build node? Like, do I have to manage the virtual machine myself, or can Jenkins do the provisioning on the cloud service provider for me?
In fact, it's as you please. You can do it as bare metal as you want, or you can do it with plugins. I haven't installed Kubernetes plugin in there. I am not specialist of this plugin either, but you can define what we call cloud in Jenkins. So you can define new clouds, and then it will use these clouds to how do you call that? Spawn new agents dynamically. And you can, of course, tag your builds with some labels. For example, you want builds to happen on Arch64, so you put it in your pipeline, say it will only happen on node which have the tags Docker and Arch64, and it will spawn a new pod on the Arch64 machine. Yeah.
So for cloud native application developers, is a common pattern that they would be using, for example, Kubernetes, they'd have a Jenkins core running on Kubernetes in a pod, and then that would automatically provision containers with the Jenkins agent on demand for x86 or ARM64 builds?
Yeah, that's the way it works. I think it's even the way that the Jenkins infrastructure is working, because we
Okay.
have, our agents are only on Azure, I think, for the time being. But there will be time in the future when some of them will be on Azure, some of them will be on AWS, some of them will be on DigitalOcean, for example, and we will share that among all of these cloud providers without any problem. And we are even reusing, because of money, what is it called? Spot instances. I think,
Okay.
something that can be closed, shut down at any time, even during a build, just because it's cheaper, and we can deal with that. The Kubernetes project can handle that.
And for projects that are, for example, tied to using VMs rather than containers, can you integrate the provisioning of virtual machines automatically with something like, Terraform templates or open
Yes,
tofu, I
it's
guess now?
it's also what is on Jenkins infra. I don't know. Yeah, I know some clients do it also, but the infra uses Terraform, and we have, how is it called? We have something called the all-in-one image. It's a tool that builds Docker image, VM image, everything with the same source of truth. For the versions of Debian, of Git, of whatever. And yes, of course, you can spin up some VMs when needed.
And I guess just to explain for our listeners, the reason you would want to do that is because you don't want to have build agents running all the time if they're not running builds, when you
No,
can
it's
just
costly.
bring them up and tear them down on demand for when a build is kicked off.
You're right.
Do you have any advice for people who are considering a transition to ARM64?
It's not, Jenkins, we are using Java, so it's kind of easy cheating to go to ARM64, but that's not always the case for other programs, maybe written in C and so on. So there are a few things to check if you want to port your software to ARM64. Uh, yeah, but that's manageable, totally manageable. The thing is, it's more about people than software or hardware. You have to have the community involved in the project to migrating or transitioning to ARM64 or adding just another architecture. Before everything, you have to have people want to do that. Of course, the end users want it, but you have to have the maintainers, the contributors, everybody to get it to work. And I think the most tricky part is the CI part. Because even if your code is ported to ARM64, even if the end users are ready to take it, even if the contributors understood and know what to do, if you don't have the CI part, you're in deep trouble.
And what has your experience been with the Ampere developer community?
A few years ago, when I was advocating for ARM64, I'm fanboy. At work, for example, people were looking at me and say, stop it, please stop it, we just don't care. And I was still, advocacy, but I love it. You have to take a look at that, you have to invest some time, and people were just bored. And then when you go to your community, there is an echo. People say, yeah, of course. And then it allowed us to be, just a neighbor of Jeff Gilling, for example. Thank you for that. Because it's just a member of your community, and it's pretty easy to get in touch with him and other people really involved in the community, involved in the ARM ecosystem. It's a joy to be there, frankly.
Thank you, Bruno, for joining us today. Jenkins is a really important project in the cloud native ecosystem. And as we've said repeatedly, we see cloud native application development as the wave of the future. CI projects like Jenkins that also do continuous deployment are a key part of getting those applications that are traditional legacy applications onto the cloud. And so as a key part of that platform migration from legacy to future, we see Jenkins and Ampere as partners in some sense. So thank you for joining us and telling us a little bit about your project. And we look forward to seeing you around the Ampere community.